Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Giza Lopez, and I am the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. Let me start by thanking each of you for joining us today in this virtual space and for making time to learn more about research into youth justice issues. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're from. As always, we're very grateful to our partners in New York State. It is their support that allows us to bring this series to you. Thanks to the Division of Criminal Justice Services, to the Office of Children and Family Services, to the University at Albany, and to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. Last month, we marked 2 years of Lunch and Learn webinars. For those of you who have attended since the beginning, we appreciate you. If you're new to the series and would like to see one of our past trainings, or many, they are available on our website, and someone will drop the link in chat any moment now. We are lucky to get to spend the next hour in your company and with Dr. Telzer. Thanks for being here, Dr. Telzer. So without any more delay, Brian, take it away. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Brian Rainey, and I am a research fellow at the YJI. Now, before we begin, I just have one announcement. The Long Island Regional Youth Justice Team in New York State recently completed its Words from My Soul project. This project encouraged youth voice through theater and storytelling, and participating youth created 10 short videos about their stories, and professionally drawn digital illustrations accompany each video. After the closing announcements today, we will be showing this video, which will last no longer than 2 minutes. So feel free to stick around and view this amazing work. Now, I think that we're all really looking forward to today's presentation, so I don't want to further delay hearing from an expert on adolescent brain development. Dr. Ava Telzer is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from UCLA in 2012. Her research examines how social and cultural processes shape adolescent brain development with a focus on both pro-social and risk-taking behaviors, family and peer relationships, and long-term psychological well-being. She is particularly interested in using science to help debunk many of the stereotypes of adolescence. For example, risk-taking is not inevitable nor negative. Teens don't orient away from their family, and adolescents are not self-centered but are highly other-oriented and pro-social. She has authored over 170 publications and has received numerous awards for her work, including the American Psychological Association's Boyd McCandless Award for early career contribution to psychological developmental psychology, the American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Award for early career contribution to psychology, and was named a Rising Star by the Association for Psychological Science. Her research is supported by the National Science Foundation, Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, National Institute of Drug Abuse, and National Institute of Mental Health. So, without further ado, Dr. Ava Telzer.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here and seeing all of the participants in the chat introducing themselves. I'm so impressed with how many folks showed up today. So let me share my screen. Let's see, one sec. You all can see my slides now. All right, so I am going to be talking today about a developmental neuroscience perspective on the risks and opportunities of adolescence. So I want to start with a quick thought experiment. One second. All right, so let's start with a quick thought experiment. So I want you to conjure up an image of an adolescent and think about the first kind of words that come to mind when you think about the typical adolescent. If you want to throw in to the chat, what's the first image or word or behavior that you'd use to describe the typical adolescent? Oh, I'm seeing some good ones in there. Oh, there's so many. Oh, this is great. there's so many, I can't even keep up with them all. But what I'm seeing here is a lot of words like risky, impulsive, let's see here, insecure, moody, emotional. So a lot of potentially some negative words that we would think might describe adolescence. I'm also seeing some positive words, fun and free spirit. Let's see, let's find some other ones, curious, developing. So these are great. Oftentimes when I pose this word or this question to individuals, the first words that come up to describe adolescence are things that describe risky and reckless behaviors. So engaging in risk-taking like vaping or jumping off of a high cliff because your friends encouraged you to, or potentially drinking and driving, or engaging in unprotected sexual behaviors. And the reason that many of these kind of more negative, risky behaviors often come to mind is not surprising, given that morbidity and mortality rates increase 300% from childhood to adolescence. So this really does make adolescent risk-taking a public health concern. But what's often overlooked is that the survival rate of US high school students in the United States is 99.9%. So most adolescents are not necessarily engaging in these more severe risk-taking behaviors and are actually engaging in more normative aspects of risk-taking. Now, these negative stereotypes of adolescence are really abundant. And so adolescents are often described as rebellious and disrespectful, uncaring, rude, unmannered. And it's problematic that these negative stereotypes exist. And I'll be describing today why that's the case and try to debunk some of these stereotypes. And these negative stereotypes are often attributed to adolescents' immature or broken brains. And so adolescent brains are often depicted in media portrayals as full of emotions, with brain regions dedicated for sex and angst and being having poor self-control. And the result is that these negative aspects characterizing adolescence are thought to be due to these biological immaturities in the brain. So they're wired to be this way. Now, this is particularly problematic because negative stereotypes can become self-fulfilling prophecies. So in other words, adolescents who view the teenage years as a time of risk-taking or engaging in other negative behaviors or devaluing the family or acting out in school, these ideas about what adolescents are can reflect what they see as normative during this developmental period, and they may use this as a standard for their own behavior. So these stereotypes can actually contribute to adolescents' behaviors in ways that make them self-fulfilling prophecies. Now I'm going to share with you a quick study that we did to show this link across adolescence. And so this was led by Young Kyu, who's now a professor at Northwestern University. And what he did is he examined how negative conceptions of adolescence might be related to changes in adolescents' own self-reported risk-taking behaviors, as well as changes in how their brains function over time. So in 7th grade, he asked adolescents about their stereotypes of adolescence. He followed them across the middle school to high school transition to see how their own risk-taking behaviors changed and how their brains were changing during this developmental period. And what he found is that these negative conceptions of adolescence were related to increases in risk-taking behaviors across that middle school to high school transition. So adolescents who thought that the teenage years were more of this negative time of devaluing the family and increasing risk-taking behaviors actually showed increases in risk-taking over the next 2 years. And we also found that this was substantiated in the developing brain. So adolescents who had more negative conceptions of adolescence showed longitudinal changes in the prefrontal cortex, so brain regions that are really important for cognitive control. And so this suggests that when adolescents view the teenage years as this more negative time, when they have these more negative stereotypes of adolescence, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy both in their behavior and in how their brain is functioning in terms of these cognitive control regions across the following couple years. Now, in contrast to adolescence being this negative developmental period when they're self-centered and engaging in risk-taking and devaluing the family, the adolescent years are actually a very positive developmental period when the developing brain is promoting social connection and competence, caring, as well as positive risks. So oftentimes when we think of risk-taking during adolescence, we're thinking of teens jumping off of a cliff or engaging in substance use or stealing from a store. But it's a time when teens are engaging in very positive types of risks. For example, raising your hand in class can be a risk for some kids who might be shy of being laughed at, but the risk of getting your question answered by your teacher, or asking your crush on a date could be another type of positive risk where you're putting yourself on the line to see if the kid in class that you might like will go out with you. And so today what I'm going to do is try to show some research from my lab that describes how the developing brain may be promoting some positive outcomes in adolescence. And we're going to try to debunk some of these negative or even just wrong stereotypes of adolescence. All stereotypes are not necessarily negative per se. We just need the science to back up some of these claims. All right, so we're going to start with one set of studies trying to examine the differential role of parents and peers on adolescence. And so I'm going to start here with a poll. So Brian, if you can pull up the first poll, what I want you to answer is that this question of when it comes to influencing teens' risky decisions, who do you think has a bigger influence, parents or peers? All right, so let's pull up the answer. All right, so it looks like about 56% of the audience is voting for peers and another 20-ish% for both equally or parents. All right, so well, let me show you the set of studies that are going to help answer this question. All right, I'm going to close that on my screen. All right. So in a set of studies, what we tried to understand is this kind of age-old question. Do parents or peers have a bigger influence on teenagers? There's and I think this is supported by both the poll that we just did, as well as the general assumption out there that when it comes to influencing teens, peers are going to have a much bigger influence. There's these age-old sayings, if your peers jumped off a bridge, would you too? We don't have a similar saying, if your mom jumped off a bridge, would you too? And so there's this general assumption out there that peers are going to have a larger influence on teens when it comes to their risk-taking behavior. Surprisingly, there has not been much research, if any, really asking this question in the literature. Most research that's looked at influence effects has looked at, do peers influence teens without understanding the simultaneous influence of parents and peers. So you can imagine in a teen's everyday life, if they go to a party, perhaps, they may be introduced to the potential to drink alcohol, and they may have on one side their peers influencing them to drink, and on the other side, their kind of value system of their parents probably discouraging them from drinking. So how do they weigh these conflicting influences from peers and parents, and who do they go along with? Are they more likely to go along with their peers, as we might assume just based on the kind of assumptions out there, or are they more likely to follow their parents' guidance? And so what we did is we created a novel experimental task in which we tried to test this question. And so what I'm going to show you is the results of this study, in which we gave teens conflicting influence from their parents and their peers. And so what we did is we measured their risk-taking behavior at baseline, just to get a baseline measure of how often they're risky. And then we brought them in and we scanned their brains while we presented them with conflicting influence, where they either saw influence where their parent said, take the risky decision, and their peer said, no, play it safe, or vice versa, where the peer was pushing them to make the risky decision and the parent was pushing them to play it safe. And so what we found is that at baseline, without any conflicting influence, adolescents made risky decisions about 60% of the time. Now, when they were presented with this conflicting social influence, what we found might be surprising to you. So when their parents said, take the risky decision, but the peer said, no, play it safe, we see this significant increase in their risk-taking behavior. So this is suggesting to us that they're following their parents' advice here and becoming more risky than their baseline when their parent is sort of giving them that permission to do so, even when their peer is saying, no, don't do it, play the safe option. Now, when we look at the reverse condition, what we see is that we don't see this effect for peers. So when peers are saying play it, or when the peers are saying be risky, it's pretty surprising. We do not see this increase in risk-taking behavior. And what we think is driving this effect is that the parent is saying, no, play it safe. And so the teen is not increasing that risk-taking behavior. So this suggests to us that parents may be serving as this kind of gatekeeper to teens' risk-taking. When parents endorse risks, teens are more likely to increase their risk-taking behavior, even when the peer is saying to play it safe. And when peers endorse the safe behavior, teens are not increasing their risk behavior, even though their peers, who supposedly should be showing this strong peer influence effect, are suggesting to be risky. The teens are not following that advice. Now, when we look at the brain, what we see is that when adolescents decided to take the risk in line with their parents' risky decision, what we're seeing is enhanced connectivity between the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, shown right here, and the ventral striatum. And this connectivity we see is enhanced during the condition where parents are pushing them to be risky, but we do not see this connectivity when the peer is pushing them to be risky. Now, enhanced coupling between these two brain regions is linked to greater reward valuation and value-based learning. And so when their parents endorse risks, adolescents may be recruiting this VMPFC striatum connectivity as they're kind of integrating the reward-based value of their parents and conforming to what their parents want to do. But surprisingly, they're not showing this reward-based connectivity when their peers are endorsing that same behavior. Now, together, these findings suggest that parents are more likely than peers to have an influence on adolescents' risky behaviors, with activation in brain regions supporting reward valuation underlying this effect. And this suggests that teens might actually value their parents' thoughts and ideals more than their peers. And this certainly contradicts the widely held stereotype that adolescents value peers more than their parents and are going to conform to their peers more so than their parents. All right, so I'm going to share with you a second set of studies that is going to look at how adolescents are influenced in both positive and negative ways. So I'm going to ask to pull up the second poll here. So when it comes to influencing teens, do you think peers have more of a positive or negative influence? So for example, influencing teens to work harder in school versus engaging in behaviors like drinking. All right, so let's show those results. All right, so I think that you're starting to get on and know where I'm going with this, because only 18% are thinking that it's a negative influence. About a third think it's a positive influence, and then almost 50% think they will be influenced sort of no matter what for positive and negative behaviors. All right, so let's start to show you some of the findings in this area. And so there is a general stereotype out there, although perhaps not in this room at the moment, that when it comes to influencing teens, there's going to be a largely negative influence. So things like drinking behaviors or driving fast when your peers are present in the car, as opposed to some more positive behaviors like working hard in school or engaging in pro-social behaviors. And so we've sought to understand the relative effects of positive and negative influence. There's a large literature out there on adolescent conformity and peer influence that suggests that it's monolithic and unidimensional, such that adolescents will be excessively susceptible to their peers, particularly negative influence from their peers. And so we wanted to test this empirically, as it hadn't been yet done in the literature. And so this is a study led by a previous grad student in the lab, Kathy Doe, in which we tested both positive pro-social contexts and negative antisocial contexts in this peer influence context. So again, we created a novel experimental task to test this, where adolescents were exposed to positive influence and negative influence from their peers. And so they could conform the peers' attitudes towards positive behaviors like working hard in school, or negative behaviors like drinking alcohol or smoking a cigarette. So I'm going to orient you to this graph first before I show you the results. So the y-axis here is showing you their probability of conformity. And so scores close to 100 at the top here are going to indicate that they are conforming to their peers 100% of the time. Scores around 50 indicate that they're sort of at chance level. They conform at a 50-50 level. And then scores below 0.5 under here are indicating that they're less likely to conform to peer influence. They're resisting that peer influence. Now, first, I'm going to show you a couple bars, and I want to draw your attention to their overall rate of conformity. And for both negative behaviors like drinking and driving, and positive behaviors like being pro-social or trying hard in school, conformity here is significantly below chance. So they are conforming less than chance levels. In other words, they're resisting their peers and sticking with their own pre-existing attitudes and not going along with their peers. So on average, they conformed only about 35% of the time. And so this means that adolescents are more likely to resist social influence on average than they are to conform to social influence from their peers. Now, when they did conform, they're doing so selectively. When adolescents were presented with negative behaviors from their peers versus positive behaviors, they were more likely to conform to their peers on these positive than negative behaviors. In other words, they're more likely to go along with their peers, with what their peers thought in terms of behaviors like trying hard in school and volunteering or helping their siblings with homework. And they're less likely to go along with what their peers thought on behaviors like drinking or engaging in safe sex or cheating. So positive behaviors, they're conforming more than they are to these negative behaviors. Now, when we look at the brain, what we see is that adolescents are showing increased activation in the VMPFC. So this is a brain region that also popped up in that previous study. Again, the VMPFC is a brain region that tracks reward value. It's involved in value-based learning. And so the VMPFC here is differentially encoding the value of positive versus negative behaviors. So while adolescents are ultimately conforming more to these positive behaviors, they're actually showing greater VMPFC activation when they're conforming on these negative behaviors. And so what this suggests is that the VMPFC may elicit this stronger reward-related response when they do conform to negative behaviors, perhaps because of the lower frequency of these behaviors, making them a little bit more kind of thrilling when they do engage in it, or perhaps because the social norm or kind of stereotype that adolescents know of going along with negative behaviors may be more valued and rewarding to teens. So when they go along with those negative behaviors, it elicits more of this reward-related response. So adolescence is often characterized as this period of increased susceptibility to social influence. But when it comes to peer influence in the study, we find that teens are actually more likely to resist their peers than to be susceptible to their influence. And they resist that social influence about 70% of the time. So teens are able to stand firm in their own attitudes, even when confronted with opposing attitudes by their peers. So this is quite remarkable that they're actually really standing firm in their own attitudes when it comes to both positive and negative influence. So adolescence is this time when they're gaining independence, they're flexibly learning from the environment and interactions with others, they're establishing their own personal attitudes and values, and this is thought to underlie age-related improvements in the ability to resist social influence from their peers. And what we find is that when they do conform, although it's only about 35% of the time, they're doing so selectively, conforming to peer influence more so on these positive behaviors than negative behaviors. So adolescents are more likely to be influenced when it comes to things like helping others and trying hard in school than they are on behaviors like stealing or cheating or engaging in substance use. And again, this is supported by activation in brain regions in the reward valuation system. So that VMPFC region of the brain is activated when they are engaging in these peer influence processes. Now, this, again, challenges many prevailing conceptions of adolescence as this time of excessive conformity to negative peer influence and underscores that it's a time of positive peer influence, which is, I think, a really wonderful space for interventions and thinking about ways of really encouraging peers to engage in more positive behaviors via their exposure to other peers. All right, so this is the kind of last set of research that I want to show you today. And it's examining the intersection of risk-taking and pro-social development. And so we know from a significant body of research that risk-taking behaviors are increasing during adolescence. They peak in the mid-adolescent years. And it's also a developmental period when social competence and pro-social behaviors are increasing. Adolescents are developing the ability to engage in theory of mind and really become more other-oriented. However, these bodies of work looking at risk-taking and pro-social development have been done separately. And the intersection or relationship between risk-taking and pro-social tendencies has been overlooked. And this is a really, I think, exciting area of intersection for us to examine. And in particular, because it's often assumed that adolescents are on these developmental trajectories where they're going to develop either into positive pro-social adolescents or they're going to develop into antisocial adolescents engaging in more negative behaviors. But a critical question is whether risk-taking and pro-social tendencies might actually be related constructs that develop in tandem within adolescence, and that these seemingly paradoxical behaviors may actually be working together. Now, we know that changes in the developing brain are supporting both risk and opportunity. And interestingly, the very same neural systems that are engaged during risk-taking behaviors also support pro-social, other-oriented behaviors. So again, the valuation system, which I've talked about a little bit today, includes brain regions such as the ventral striatum and that VMPFC area that I talked about in the previous two studies. And those code for reward value, and they're activated when we feel good. So when positive things happen or things that we enjoy occur, these brain regions are activated. And so the ventral striatum tends to be highly engaged when teens engage in risks, probably because it's a thrilling, rewarding experience for teens to engage in those behaviors. But this same brain region is also activated when teens engage in pro-social and other oriented behaviors, for instance, when helping their family or engaging in activities that benefit others, probably because it feels good to help others and do good things. Now, while many assume that adolescents develop risks or opportunities, these can occur in tandem, and their intersection may be what makes adolescence a particularly unique developmental period. So the intersection of pro-social and risk-taking behaviors really challenges the widely held model of adolescence as this period of vulnerability by suggesting that potentially traditionally negative behaviors like risk-taking could actually foster positive development if those risks are taken to benefit others. So as a first stab at trying to understand the intersection between pro-social and risk-taking behaviors, we examined this as a just correlation in a large sample of youth. We used the brain time study out of Evelina Kroon's lab in Leiden, which is in the Netherlands, to examine the correlation, again, between positive behaviors like pro-social behavior and rebellious behaviors like drinking and driving. So what we found is that adolescents who report more pro-social behaviors also tend to report more rebellious behaviors. So there's this positive correlation between pro-social and rebellious behaviors. So this means that teens who tend to be more pro-social also tend to engage in more risk-taking behaviors. So this tells us that adolescents are not developing risk-taking or pro-social tendencies, but they're developing both in tandem. And so these findings suggest that this early or mid-adolescent developmental period may be this sensitive period when teens are high in risk-taking and at the same time high in other oriented motivations like pro-social behaviors. And the convergence of these two may promote what we call pro-social risk-taking. And so these are behaviors that may be risky, but are done with the intention of helping others. So we know from many kind of current event examples that indeed there are many adolescents out there today taking extreme risks that are pro-social in nature. So for example, standing up against racism, climate change, and gun violence. And many of the examples that we see out there are teenagers and not adults. And so I think that this provides really nice kind of grounding to suggest that this is a developmental period when teens are kind of perfectly poised to engage in behaviors that elicit both their tendencies to be risky, but their tendencies also to be other-oriented, and that this may not be happening in adolescents or in adults relative to adolescents because of changes in the developing brain, particularly in reward valuation regions, which drive sensation seeking, but also other regions of the brain, which I didn't talk about today, that are involved in social sensitivity and really engaging in other-oriented thinking, which are also developing during this adolescent period. So I started my talk by describing many of the negative stereotypes of adolescence, and these studies that I presented today, I hope, provide a more accurate lens in describing adolescence as both a time of risks and opportunities. So we know that risk-taking increases, but in parallel, most adolescents are developing social competence. They're showing rises in perspective taking and considering the needs of others. It's a time of autonomy and resistance to peer influence, when youth are more likely to be influenced by positive, pro-social peers than they are by negative, antisocial peers. And so our call to action, I hope, is to really expose teens to more positive peer models, to help foster environments with pro-social norms, to help dispel the stereotype that teens are spoiled, entitled, and risky, but instead are courageous, energetic, optimistic, and really smart, as this New York Times article is quoting here. So I'll end there with a big thank you to all of the folks in my lab, the funding mechanisms that have supported this research, of course, our participants and families, and also thank you for listening today.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Telzer. So now we're going to begin the informal conversation portion, where I ask you some questions that have been on my mind, but then we're going to move into the audience Q&A portion, as we always do. So during your presentation, you noted that youth's ideas about adolescence reflect what they see as normative, which they may use as a standard for their own behavior. So I was wondering if you could perhaps speak to how both pro-social and, quote, anti-social behaviors are developmentally normative for youth.
Yeah, sure. So biologically speaking, they're developmentally normative because of changes in the developing brain. So adolescence is this time when the brain is undergoing pretty dramatic structural and functional reorganization. It is becoming highly sensitive to the social environment, which means that the things that they see out there become integrated into their ideas about what it means to be an adolescent. The environment really shapes the brain in many ways. But at the same time, it's developmentally normative for the brain to be highly responsive to rewards, as well as to be developing these other oriented tendencies. And so those could be good and bad things. Quote unquote antisocial behaviors can be highly rewarding because teens are very reward oriented. And that means that risk taking is peaking during this time. And as I mentioned early in the talk, risks are oftentimes perceived as antisocial, but they can also be very positive risks or even pro-social risks, like I talked about at the end of my talk. And then these pro-social tendencies are also increasing as the adolescent brain becomes highly sensitive to its social environment. So they're highly socially sensitive. So teens start to develop the ability to engage in more mentalizing, so thinking about the thoughts of others, understanding others' needs. And this is what really contributes to being able to engage in pro-social tendencies. Ability to understand and know the needs of others to engage in that mentalizing process.
So I was wondering, what do you think is the most important takeaway from your presentation for youth justice practitioners specifically?
Sure. So I think one important takeaway for just everybody is for us to check our stereotypes at the door, our assumptions of what is normative during adolescence. There is our general assumptions that aren't necessarily negative per se, but something just as simple as parents or peers kind of influencing teens more, or there being a more kind of negative bias towards thinking that teens are biologically programmed to engage in negative behaviors. I think it's really important to understand that the adolescent brain is just such a remarkable thing that's changing and developing and is biologically programmed for really, really great things like seeking independence and learning and exploring the environment. And it's not biologically programmed to like fail in cognitive control or go out and be risky or be unable to resist peer influence. And so it's the brain is just such a remarkable developing organ in the brain or in the body that is a really positive thing for teens. And I think having that perspective as opposed to thinking of it as broken or incapable of engaging in cognitive controls is a really important kind of takeaway.
So relatedly, based on the research findings that you've described here in your presentation, how might practitioners and advocates best serve youth? How might they best support them in their daily work?
Yeah, so I didn't present this work today, but there is some other research coming out of my lab showing that the kind of social context can really shape how teens turn out, kind of for better or for worse. And so providing adolescents with a social context that is really positive versus a more kind of negative social context has a really profound effect on teens who are what I'll kind of call neurobiologically sensitive. And by that, I mean highly responsive to rewards in their environment. And so if you place a teen in a highly sensitive teen around antisocial peers, for example, they're going to be kind of pushed towards those more antisocial behaviors. But that same teen who is very sensitive to their environment, placed in a very positive environment around pro-social peers or positive kind of family contexts, is going to actually thrive. And so finding ways to change the context. We're not going to go in and like try to change teenagers' brains. If they're highly sensitive to rewards in their environment, we should find ways to support their kind of need for rewards in very positive ways that's going to help them thrive in the face of potential adversities or other negative things. So, for example, like detention is the worst thing that you could do for teenagers who are acting out, because you're putting them around other teens who are acting out too, which is actually going to spiral into a more negative context or a negative outcome. Whereas creating interventions that bring teens who are acting out into a context with peers who are, doing more positive behaviors can have a really strong and positive influence.
And for the researchers here, what do you think future research on this topic should look like? What should we be exploring?
Yeah, so everything that I shared with you today was cross-sectional, which means that we just took a snapshot of teenagers in one moment to look at how these effects are unfolding at that age. But what is absolutely important and what my lab is now really focused on is doing longitudinal research. So that means we're following adolescents over time and doing these same experimental tasks and scanning their brains multiple times to see what's changing. So what I showed you today was mostly in the 13 to 14-year-old age range. But it might be that 12-year-olds or 17-year-olds show a very different effect. And that would be very important for us to know, because the effects that I'm sharing with you might not generalize to all teenagers across, the whole developmental spectrum. And so understanding this using longitudinal methods is the key next step for us to understand how these effects may either differ or change across the adolescent years.
Thank you. So we're now going to begin the audience Q&A portion. And as a reminder, after the Q&A and closing remarks, we will be showing one of the clips from the Long Island Regional Youth Justice Team's Words for My Soul project. So be sure to stick around. So for the first audience Q&A question, we have a lot of questions actually about your study with Kwon Do and McCormick. And so the first question is, what was the risky situation that was presented to study participants, and how was it presented?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I didn't go into the nitty-gritty of the methods, but I'm happy to also share the papers with anybody who wants to read those details. But in short, it was a very simple risk-taking task. It was, they were presented with an option to go fishing. And there is the risk is to fish. The play it safe option is to not fish. If they make the decision to fish, there's green fish and red fish that they could receive, in which case, if they get a green fish, they earn points. If they get a red fish, they lose points. And at the end of the game, they're actually paid out those earnings. And so it's a risky option to go fishing because they may actually lose points, but the reward is a potential financial benefit. And so playing it safe is they're going to skip and not fish. And the different ponds they can see have more or less green fish or red fish. So there's riskier ponds and safer ponds. And so that parent and peer advice is go fish or like don't go fish. So the risky versus safe advice from the parent and the peer.
So one attendee was curious about how you might be accounting for attachment or the quality of relationships with parents or peers. So for example, for youth who have insecure attachment to their parents, might these results hold?
Yes, such an important question. And something that we have studied a lot in my lab is how the quality of parent and peer relationships might impact adolescents' decisions to be risky. And as you can imagine, having positive family relationships, which we've measured mostly in terms of conflict in the home, but also a sense of family obligation, familism, which we've studied in Mexican families. And we've also looked at parent attachment as well as sibling attachment. All of these are related to what you would probably expect. More negative family relationships are actually promoting more risk-taking, whereas a family with positive family relationships is having that positive role. We see a similar thing with peers. So when you have high conflict peer relationships, there's this enhanced risk-taking behavior. All of this is supported by ventral striatum, or this reward-related brain region when engaging in risks. But having supportive peer relationships sort of buffers that negative peer influence effect. So having conflictual peer relationships is bad, but if you have a supportive peer, you're sort of buffered from some of those negative peer effects, which kind of suggests that having a really close, like best friend can really serve positive effects in the face of like a teen who might be rejected by their peers and have a lot of peer conflict in their life.
So a lot of attendees are actually interested in your sample. So they were wondering if you could tell us a little more about the sample in your study. And then also, how might these studies inform us about young people who might be justice system involved?
Yes, so so these teens are all from the community, and so they're not recruited. They're not justice involved teens or really engaging in the most extreme risks. I would say that they are kind of representative of the kind of typical adolescent in a kind of typical middle school or early high school or the early high school years. We try to get very diverse teens, both ethnically, racially, socioeconomically, in our research. And so these studies that I presented today are showing results from a community sample. But we've done, actually, that I didn't share with you today, several studies where we recruited community or justice involved adolescents and asked the kind of question of, is there something sort of quantitatively different? Like, is it just like they're on a spectrum of risk? Or is there something qualitatively different about teens who engage in these more kind of extreme behaviors relative to like a community-based sample? And interestingly, it's not that like, I'll try to say this as simply as I can, because it's actually quite complicated. When we look at teens who are involved in the justice system, they're not just showing kind of extreme levels of everything that we see in our community-based sample. They're not showing like just higher on average risks on our tasks and higher reward-related activation on our tasks. They're showing what we kind of say is qualitatively different responses, suggesting that it's like a different set of neural systems and things that are happening at the neural level that may drive some of the behaviors that they're engaging in. So it's a really interesting but complicated set of findings. Again, I'm happy to share some of those papers for those interested in getting more into the nuance of those data.
Yeah, and relatedly, are there any particular facets of identity, such as socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, sex, that might influence decision making or risk taking? Are these groups quantitatively or qualitatively different in some ways?
Yeah, so we depending on our research question, we've looked at different groups of adolescents based on identity. So in the work I presented today, we have not looked at race or socioeconomic or gender identity effects in terms of like peer influence or parent influence effects. But we have in terms of more kind of just general risk taking. We've done some cross-cultural work looking at teens in China versus teens in the US, and we see differences in both risk-taking behavior as well as these, again, reward-related regions being activated differently in these groups. And what's interesting, if we kind of link that to the stereotypes of adolescence in China, there is not this general assumption that adolescence is this increased time of risk-taking and orienting away from the family. Those negative stereotypes tend to be a lot lower. And when we look at their risk-taking behavior on some of our experimental tasks, their risk-taking is lower. And at the neural level, this reward-related activation is lower. And so to me, this suggests that these stereotypes are really driving the types of behaviors you engage in, as well as the neural systems that support that. There's also probably other kind of cultural beliefs, familial values that come into play here. So we've looked at Latino adolescents and how their familial values impact their both risk-taking and reward-based neural activation, and teens from Latinx backgrounds who place more emphasis on familism tend to show lower risk-taking behavior on our risk-taking tasks, as well as lower activation in these reward-based regions when they engage in risk-taking, underscoring that it's not just the stereotypes of adolescence, but also the kind of value systems that you're raised in at home that can change how adolescents are processing risks in their environment.
So there is some skepticism in the audience regarding whether the information yielded by these studies applies to youth interacting with the justice system, since it is primarily a general or community sample. So we're wondering if you could speak to this a little.
Yeah, sure. And I'm trying to think of data to help speak to this and not just speculate. And so let's see here. It's a challenge to apply specific results from one sample to another very specific sample that may be engaging in those more extreme kind of risks and antisocial behaviors. And actually, I need to speculate because we don't have the data. It would be very interesting to look at youth involved in the justice system to see if the very question of positive versus negative influence holds in that sample. It would be really cool if they were also more influenced by positive influence from their peers, but it's very possible that we would see the opposite effect in a justice-involved sample. And I think we really need the data to be able to answer that question.
I have to say, I love it when new research questions sort of come out of these webinars. So another question is, do other adults, such as mentors or youth program leaders, teachers, do they have a level of influence that is more similar to parents or to peers?
Great question. So we've done a study where we looked at just the effect of having a parent present, having an adult present, and having a peer present when teens engaged in risky behaviors. And what we found is that when a parent was present versus when adolescents took risks alone, adolescents engaged in significantly less risks when their parent was there with them. Again, the reward-related regions of the brain activation was significantly lower when the parent was there. When an unknown adult, so this doesn't quite answer your question, was there, we do not see that same effect. So just having an adult present does not serve this buffering role when it comes to risk taking, and it does not change how the brain responds in that risky context. But a future direction is certainly to look at whether other role models, whether that's a coach or a pastor or somebody that teens look up to, might also have a similar role as parents.
Great, thank you so much. So Dr. Telzer, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for taking the time to share this really fascinating information with all of us. But before I get to the closing announcements, do you have any last thoughts or insights for us?
I don't think I do. I'm just so excited to have gotten the opportunity to talk to this diverse group, and your questions were wonderful, and I wish we had hours more to talk to each other. I'm happy for anybody to reach out to me if you do have follow-up questions.
Great, thank you. So before closing announcements, we would like to ask all of you how you felt about today's webinar. So in a moment, I will be launching a poll question asking how much you agree or disagree with the statement, the webinar was informative. So please answer this question to the best of your ability so that we know how today's webinar went for you. And I am going to launch that now. And so while you all are answering that question, I do have just a few announcements and items to put on everyone's radar. So the YJI is excited to announce the launch of its Youth Justice Peer Advisory Council. So young adults 18 to 25 years old interested in advising state and local youth justice leaders on youth policies and practices and system reform should apply if they are interested. Highly preferred applicants include youth with experience in juvenile justice, youth of color, and LGBTQIA+ youth. So if interested, get your application in as soon as possible. And applications can be found at the link that we are about to put in into the chat, excuse me. Immediately following this webinar, we will be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete the survey as it allows you to provide further feedback and questions for us. This information is also used to improve future webinar sessions. So the survey should take no longer than 5 minutes, and we will also be putting the link for this survey in the chat now. And finally, if you've not done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. And in closing, I just want to thank all of you for taking part in this session of the YJI's Lunch and Learn webinar series. We really hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about the work that Dr. Telzer has presented today. And we also look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars.